At my grandson's wedding, everyone laughed when I saw my table with only a trash can and a card. Old woman who pays the bill. My daughter-in-law smiled. I simply raised my glass and made the announcement that made her faint. The greedy woman never saw it coming. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Opal, and at 65 years old, I thought I had seen every possible way a family could break your heart. I was wrong. The invitation to my grandson Tommy's wedding arrived 3 weeks ago, printed on expensive cream cardstock with gold lettering. Mr. and Mrs. Clark Henderson request your presence. My son's name was there, but not mine. Not Mr. and Mrs. Clark Henderson and Mrs. Opal Henderson, just them. Still, I told myself it was an oversight. After all, it was Tommy's special day, and I had helped raise that boy when Clark and Lonnox were too busy building their careers. I spent 2 days shopping for the perfect dress, a soft lavender silk that didn't scream, grandmother trying too hard, but showed I respected the occasion. I even splurged on new shoes, though my feet aren't what they used to be. I wanted to look dignified, worthy of being there. The country club was magnificent. White roses everywhere, crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across marble floors. The kind of venue that cost more than most people's cars. I felt proud walking in, knowing my family could afford such elegance. Tommy looked handsome in his tuxedo, so much like Clark at that age. For a moment, my heart swelled with grandmother's pride. Then I approached the reception desk to find my table assignment. Name? The young woman asked, scanning her tablet with manicured nails. Opal Henderson. I'm the groom's grandmother. She scrolled, frowned, scrolled again. Oh yes, here you are. Her voice changed, became careful, pitying. Table. Well, it's not exactly a table number. You're at the overflow seating. Overflow seating. The words hit me like cold water. She handed me a small card, and I had to read it twice before the words sank in. Where other guests had elegant table numbers like Table 1 or Table 8, my card simply read, Overflow, Corner Station. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. I'm immediate family. The girl's expression grew more uncomfortable. I just follow the seating chart, ma'am. The family provided all the arrangements. I followed her directions with growing dread, walking past beautifully decorated round tables filled with laughing guests, past the wedding party's table adorned with white orchids, past even the vendor's designated area. In the far corner, near the service entrance, sat a small folding table. Not even a real table, the kind they use for coat checks. On it sat a single item, a plastic garbage bin, and attached to the bin was a handwritten sign in Lonnox's precise script. Old lady who pays the bills. The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the folding table, my legs suddenly unsteady. Around me, other guests had noticed. I could hear whispers, see pointing fingers, catch fragments of conversations. Is that really for the grandmother? How awful! Who would do such a thing? But louder than all of that was the sound of familiar laughter. I turned and saw Lonnox across the room, radiant in her mother-of-the-groom dress, surrounded by her friends. She was looking directly at me, and her smile was not one of embarrassment or apology. It was satisfaction. Pure, undisguised satisfaction. Clark stood beside her, adjusting his tie, and when he followed her gaze to me, he didn't rush over to fix the mistake. He didn't look shocked or angry. He looked away. He simply looked away. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my ribs. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some wedding planner's error. This was deliberate. This was planned. A server approached me, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Tommy. Ma'am, can I get you anything? A chair, perhaps? Even the staff felt sorry for me. No, I managed. I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. I was standing in a corner next to a garbage bin while my family celebrated 50 feet away, and they had put me here on purpose. The woman who had worked double shifts for 30 years so Clark could go to college. The woman who had helped with the down payment on their first house. The woman who had quietly slipped money into Tommy's college fund without ever asking for recognition. I thought about leaving, Every instinct screamed at me to walk out with whatever dignity I had left. But something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the realization that this moment had been building for years, and running away wouldn't change anything. I remained standing by that folding table, holding my small purse with both hands, watching my family celebrate without me. Other guests continued to stare, some with pity, others with curiosity. I caught Tommy's new bride looking over with confusion, clearly not understanding why the groom's grandmother was exiled to a corner. Tommy himself finally noticed during the cocktail hour. He broke away from his groomsmen and approached me, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Grandma Opal, what are you doing over here?" he asked, and I could see he genuinely didn't know. "This is where your parents seated me," I said simply. His expression darkened. "This has to be a mistake. Let me talk to them." I watched him march across the room to his parents. I saw him gesture emphatically toward me, saw Clark shrug, saw Lonix lean in and whisper something that made Tommy's shoulders slump. He returned to me looking defeated. They said it was the only space left," he said, but his eyes told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. I patted his arm. "It's your wedding day, sweetheart. Don't worry about your old grandmother." But as he walked away, I saw him glance back with something that looked like shame. Good, he should feel ashamed. The dinner service began, and servers brought elegant plates to every table in the room except mine. No plate came to the corner where I stood. When I approached a server to ask, he looked confused and said he'd been told that station wasn't being served. So I stood there, hungry, alone, next to a garbage bin with a cruel sign, while my family dined on salmon and prime rib just yards away. Other guests began offering me food from their plates, their kindness making my humiliation even more complete. That's when I made my decision. This would be the last time they made me beg for scraps of love and respect. The last time I would stand in a corner hoping someone would remember I existed. I had given them everything I had to give. It was time to take something back. Standing in that corner, watching my family feast while I went hungry, my mind drifted back to how we got here. How had the woman who sacrificed everything become the family embarrassment relegated to a garbage station? It started 35 years ago when Clark was just 17 and announced he wanted to be a doctor. His father, my late husband Robert, had been a mechanic with big dreams but small means. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, Clark was halfway through his senior year of high school, and I was left with a mountain of medical bills and a mortgage I could barely afford on my secretary's salary. "I can't go to college now, Mom," Clark had said that night, sitting at our kitchen table with college brochures spread before him. "We need the money." "You will go to college," I told him firmly. "Your father wanted you to be a doctor. You'll be a doctor." What I didn't tell him was that I had already taken a second job cleaning offices at night. 4 hours of sleep became my normal routine. I would work at the insurance company from 8 to 5, grab a quick dinner, then clean corporate buildings from 7 until midnight. On weekends, I cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. My back ached constantly. My hands were raw from industrial cleaning chemicals. But every month I managed to put money away for Clark's tuition. When he got into the state university, I was so proud I cried for an hour in my car outside the admissions office. College was expensive, even the state school. There were tuition payments, dormitory fees, textbooks, meal plans. Clark called home regularly those first 2 years, grateful and sweet. "Mom, I don't know how you're doing this," he'd say. "I promise I'll pay you back when I'm a doctor." I never wanted him to pay me back. I wanted him to succeed, to have the life his father never got to live. So when Clark mentioned he was struggling with organic chemistry and needed expensive tutoring, I picked up a third part-time job on weekends doing laundry for a nursing home. When he wanted to join a pre-med fraternity, I sold my wedding ring to pay the fees. Things began to change during his junior year. His calls home became shorter, less frequent. When he did call, it was usually to ask for money for something. A spring break trip, a new laptop, interview clothes for medical school applications. "I'm networking, Mom," he'd explain. "These connections will help my career." I sent the money. I always sent the money. Then he met Lonix. She was a nursing student from a wealthy family, the kind of girl who drove a car newer than any I'd ever owned and carried purses that cost more than my monthly salary. When Clark first brought her home for Christmas, I tried so hard to make a good impression. I spent my grocery money on expensive ingredients for dinner, bought wine I couldn't afford, cleaned the house until it sparkled. Lonix walked through my modest home with barely concealed disdain. I watched her take in the secondhand furniture, the faded carpet, the kitchen appliances that were older than she was. She was polite, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. "Clark tells me you work multiple jobs," she said over dinner, cutting her pot roast into tiny, precise pieces. "That must be exhausting." "I do what I need to do," I replied, and Clark shot me a warning look, as if my honesty was embarrassing. After they left, I found a magazine article torn out and left on my coffee table. It was about toxic family dynamics and financial manipulation. Someone had highlighted passages about family members who use money to control others. I knew Lonix had left it there. The message was clear. I was the problem. Medical school brought even bigger expenses. Application fees, interview travel costs, eventually tuition that made undergraduate school look cheap. By now I was working 4 jobs, sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. My health began to suffer. I developed chronic back pain, high blood pressure, constant headaches, but Clark was going to be a doctor. That dream kept me going. The engagement announcement came via text message. Not a phone call, not an invitation to celebrate. A text with a photo of Lonix's enormous diamond ring. "We're engaged, planning a summer wedding. We'll send details soon." The wedding details, when they arrived, included a price tag that made my head spin. $20,000 for 1 day. I had saved that much money exactly twice in my entire life, and both times I'd spent it on Clark's education. "We're paying for everything ourselves," Clark assured me when I called, panicked about the cost. "Lonix's parents are contributing, and I have some savings from my residency." But 2 months before the wedding, Clark called in tears. "Mom, Lonix's dad pulled out. Some business troubles, and the venue wants full payment up front or they'll cancel everything." "How much do you need?" I asked, though I already knew I couldn't afford it. $15,000. I know it's a lot, but I took out a second mortgage on my house. The house Robert and I had spent 15 years paying off was mortgaged again to pay for a wedding where I wasn't even asked to help plan anything. After the wedding, things changed completely. Clark's calls stopped almost entirely. When I called him, Lonix would often answer with excuses. "Clark's at the hospital," or "Clark's studying for boards," or "Clark's too tired to talk." I began to understand that my son's wife saw me as an unwelcome reminder of where he came from, a poor, uneducated woman who cleaned toilets for a living. She wanted to erase that part of his history, and I was living proof of it. When Tommy was born, I hoped things would change. Surely they'd want help with the baby, want their son to know his grandmother. I drove to the hospital with a bag full of baby clothes I'd been collecting for months. Lonix barely let me hold him. "We're trying to limit visitors during flu season," she said, even though her parents were there every day. "Maybe in a few weeks." Those few weeks turned into months. Every time I asked to visit, there was an excuse. Tommy was napping or sick or they were too busy. When I did manage to see him, it was for brief, supervised visits where I felt like an intruder in my own son's home. Still, I kept helping financially. When they bought their first house, I quietly contributed $5,000 toward the down payment. When Clark's practice was struggling in the early years, I sent money regularly, calling it loans, even though we both knew I'd never ask for repayment. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone, I was there with generous gifts and genuine love. And every time, I could feel myself becoming more of an obligation to them, less of a person they actually wanted around. Now, standing next to this garbage bin at my grandson's wedding, I finally understood the truth. I had spent 35 years buying love that was never for sale. I had worked myself into the ground trying to earn a place in a family that saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. But what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover, was that their ATM was about to close forever. The revelation came 3 months before Tommy's wedding, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. I was at the grocery store, struggling to reach a box of cereal on the top shelf, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Oh, you poor thing. Here, let me help you." I turned to find Margaret Sinclair, Lonix's mother, reaching for the cereal with a sympathetic smile that made my skin crawl. Margaret had always treated me like a charity case, but today something felt different, more patronizing than usual. "Thank you," I said, taking the box from her perfectly manicured hands. "How are you holding up, dear?" she asked, tilting her head in that way people do when they're about to deliver bad news. "Lonix told me about your situation. We're all so concerned." My situation? I had no idea what she meant, but something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "I'm fine, Margaret. Thank you for asking." She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a state secret. "Between you and me, I think it's wonderful how Clark and Lonix are handling everything. Not every family would be so patient with the decline." The decline. The word echoed in my head as I watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. What decline was she talking about? That evening, I called Clark. For once, he answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" How was I feeling? It was an odd question. Clark never asked about my feelings. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" There was a pause. "No reason. Just checking in. You know we worry about you." "We worry about you." Another strange phrase. Clark hadn't worried about me in years. "Clark, is there something I should know? I ran into Margaret today and she said some odd things." "What kind of things?" His voice had changed, become guarded. "She mentioned something about my situation, about some decline. I don't understand what she meant." A longer pause this time. "Mom, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If you're having trouble remembering things, or if you're confused about anything, we're here to help." Remembering things? Confused? "Clark, what are you talking about? I'm not confused about anything." Okay. I just want you to know that Lonix and I are keeping an eye on you. We love you and we want to make sure you're safe." After he hung up, I sat in my living room trying to piece together what had just happened. Why did Margaret think I was declining? Why was Clark suddenly concerned about my memory? I felt fine. I was 65, not 95. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. The answer came 2 weeks later when I went to my annual doctor's appointment. Dr. Williams had been my physician for 15 years, a kind man who knew my medical history better than I did. "How are we doing today, Opal?" he asked, settling into his chair with my chart. "I'm well, doctor. Though I have to ask you something. Has anyone from my family contacted you about my health?" His expression shifted slightly. "Why do you ask?" "I'm getting the impression that people think there's something wrong with my memory or my mental state. My son seems to think I'm declining somehow." Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. "Opal, I'm going to be direct with you. Your daughter-in-law called my office 3 weeks ago. She said the family was concerned about signs of dementia and wanted to know if I'd noticed any cognitive decline during your visits." The words hit me like a physical blow. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I couldn't discuss your medical information without your consent, and that in my professional opinion, you show no signs of cognitive impairment whatsoever. Your mind is as sharp as women half your age." Dementia. Lonix was telling people I had dementia. "Doctor, would you be willing to put that in writing? That you see no signs of cognitive decline?" He studied my face carefully. "Opal, is someone questioning your mental competency?" "I'm starting to think so." Within an hour, I had a letter from Dr. Williams stating clearly that I showed no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive impairment. But the damage was already done. How many people had Lonix told? How long had she been spreading this lie? I decided to do some investigating of my own. Over the next few weeks, I made casual calls to old friends, to people in my neighborhood, to distant relatives I rarely spoke with. The pattern became clear quickly. "Oh, Opal, how are you managing?" asked my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. "Clark mentioned you've been having some memory troubles." "Your poor son," said my cousin Betty. "Lonix told me at the church fundraiser that he's so worried about you. She said you've been getting confused about things." I ran into Clark at the bank, reported my former coworker Janet. He looked so stressed. He said you've been having a hard time remembering to pay bills and take care of yourself. Each conversation was like another piece of a puzzle falling into place. Lonix had been systematically destroying my reputation, telling everyone who would listen that I was mentally declining. She was creating a narrative that explained why my family kept me at arm's length, why I was never included in important events, why they treated me like a burden. If everyone believed I was losing my mind, then my exclusion wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. It was them being responsible caregivers managing a difficult situation. The most devastating discovery came when I called my old boss at the insurance company. "Opal, how wonderful to hear from you. Though I have to say I was shocked when your son called last month." "Clark called you?" "He was asking about your work history, your mental state when you retired. He seemed to think you might have been showing early signs of dementia even back then." I told him that was nonsense. "You were sharp as a tack until your last day." Clark had been calling my former employer, building a case for my mental incompetence. But why? What was the end game? The answer came to me gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. If they could prove I was mentally unfit, they could potentially challenge any financial decisions I made. They could argue that I wasn't competent to manage my own affairs. But there was something they didn't know. Something I had never told anyone except my lawyer. When Robert died, his life insurance policy had paid out far more than I'd ever let on. Instead of spending it all on Clark's education and their lifestyle, I had invested most of it quietly, carefully. For 35 years, while I worked multiple jobs and lived modestly, that money had been growing. The woman they thought was a poor cleaning lady living paycheck to paycheck was actually worth more than Clark and Lonix could imagine. The woman they were calling mentally incompetent had been managing a substantial portfolio for decades. I had kept it secret because I wanted Clark to value education and hard work, not inheritance. I wanted him to build his own success. But watching him allow his wife to poison my reputation, seeing him participate in this campaign to destroy my dignity, I realized he had learned nothing about values at all. They thought they were setting up a scenario where they could control a confused, helpless old woman and her modest savings. They had no idea they were actually trying to manipulate someone who could buy and sell their entire lifestyle without making a dent in her bank account. As I sat in my quiet living room that night, holding Dr. Williams' letter and thinking about all the lies Lonix had spread, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. For the first time in decades, I held all the cards. And they had no idea what game we were really playing. The morning after I discovered the truth about Lonix's lies, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but something far more important. A list of every financial contribution I had made to Clark's life over the past 35 years. The numbers were staggering, even to me. College tuition, medical school, wedding expenses, house down payment, car loans I'd co-signed, the loans I'd given them over the years that were never repaid. When I added it all up, the total was more than most people earned in a lifetime, and not once had they asked how I managed it. Not once had they wondered how a woman working as a secretary could afford to be so generous. They simply took what I offered and assumed it was everything I had. I called my lawyer, Harold Morrison, and made an appointment for that afternoon. Harold had been handling my affairs since Robert died, one of the few people who knew the true extent of my financial situation. "Opal," he said, greeting me with genuine warmth as I entered his office. "What brings you in today?" I told him everything. About the dementia rumors, about my discovery of their manipulation, about the wedding humiliation that was still 2 months away, but that I somehow knew was coming. Harold listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "I want to change my will," I said finally. "I want to make sure they understand exactly what they've lost." Harold leaned back in his leather chair, studying me carefully. "Are you certain about this, Opal? Once we implement these changes, there's no going back." I've never been more certain of anything in my life. We spent the next 3 hours going over my options. The portfolio Robert's life insurance had created, carefully managed and grown over the decades, was worth $3 million. My house, paid off years ago despite the second mortgage I'd taken for Clark's wedding, was worth another $300,000 in the current market. For 35 years, I had been a millionaire living like a pauper, sacrificing my comfort to build my son's future. And my son had repaid that sacrifice by allowing his wife to destroy my reputation and treat me like a burden. I want it all to go to charity, I told Harold. Every penny. Which charities? I had already thought about this. The scholarship fund at the community college where I took night classes, the food bank where I used to volunteer, the women's shelter downtown, organizations that actually help people instead of enabling them. Harold made notes, then looked up at me. What about Clark? Don't you want to leave him anything? A small amount, perhaps? Or some personal items? I considered this for a moment. He can have my engagement ring, the one I had to sell to pay for his fraternity fees, and then quietly replaced years later. Let him remember that. And the house, sell it. Add the proceeds to the charitable donations. Harold finished writing and set down his pen. There's something else we should discuss. Given what you've told me about their attempts to question your mental competency, we should take steps to protect this decision. What kind of steps? A comprehensive mental evaluation by an independent psychiatrist, multiple witnesses to the will signing, video documentation of your mental state and reasoning. If they try to challenge this in court, we'll have overwhelming evidence that you were completely competent when you made these decisions. 2 weeks later, I underwent the most thorough mental evaluation of my life. Dr. Sandra Chen, a psychiatrist Harold recommended, spent 4 hours testing my memory, reasoning ability, and mental acuity. The results were exactly what I expected. My cognitive function was not only normal, but actually above average for my age group. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Chen said as we finished, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you're sharper than most of my colleagues half your age. If someone is claiming you have dementia, they're either grossly misinformed or deliberately lying. I had her put that assessment in writing too. The new will was signed 3 weeks before Tommy's wedding, witnessed by Harold, his secretary, and 2 other lawyers from his firm. The video recording showed me clearly explaining my reasoning, demonstrating my mental competency, and stating unequivocally that this was my free choice made without coercion. But changing my will wasn't enough. I wanted them to understand the magnitude of what they had lost. And I wanted that understanding to come at the moment of their greatest triumph. I wanted them to realize that while they were celebrating and congratulating themselves on their cruel joke, they were actually witnessing the destruction of their financial future. The plan that formed in my mind was simple, but devastating. I would let the wedding proceed exactly as they intended. I would stand by that garbage bin, endure their humiliation, let them have their moment of cruel satisfaction. And then, when they were at their most confident, their most secure in their superiority, I would destroy them with the truth. I spent the weeks leading up to the wedding in careful preparation. I had Harold draft a letter explaining my decision, complete with copies of the mental evaluations and a detailed accounting of every dollar I had given them over the years. I arranged for copies to be sent to every major family member and friend who had been told about my supposed mental decline. I also did something else that would have surprised them. I hired a private investigator to look into their finances. What I discovered was illuminating. Clark and Lonix were living far beyond their means. The big house, the expensive cars, Lonix's designer clothes and jewelry. It was all built on credit and the assumption of future inheritance. They had been telling people, including their financial advisors, that they expected to inherit substantial assets from me. They had even used this expectation as collateral for some of their loans. The investigator also uncovered something else. Lonix had been meeting regularly with an estate planning attorney, discussing how to handle inheritance from an elderly family member with cognitive decline. She had been preparing for my death, planning how to manage what she thought would be her windfall. The cruelty of it took my breath away. She wasn't just spreading lies about my mental state to explain their treatment of me. She was actively preparing to benefit from my death while working to make my life miserable. But the most shocking discovery came in the final week before the wedding. The investigator informed me that Lonix had been researching care facilities for dementia patients. Expensive, isolated places where families could warehouse relatives they found inconvenient. She wasn't just planning to inherit my money. She was planning to have me declared incompetent and locked away. That night, I called Harold and added one final instruction to my will. In addition to leaving everything to charity, I was including a detailed explanation of exactly why I had made this choice. Every lie they had told, every manipulation they had attempted, every moment of cruelty they had inflicted, it would all be documented for anyone who wanted to understand. As I prepared for bed the night before the wedding, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Tomorrow, they would get everything they deserved. Tomorrow, their carefully constructed web of lies and manipulation would collapse around them. Tomorrow, the woman they thought was a demented old fool would prove just how sharp her mind really was. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and selected my outfit for the wedding: the lavender dress I had bought to honor the occasion, and underneath it, a small envelope containing copies of my new will and Dr. Chen's evaluation. I would carry the truth with me into their moment of triumph. They wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. Instead, they were about to humiliate themselves in ways they couldn't even imagine. Standing beside that garbage bin with the cruel sign, watching my family feast while I went hungry, I knew my moment had arrived. The humiliation was complete, the guests were uncomfortable, and Lonix was practically glowing with satisfaction at her successful cruelty. Perfect. I reached into my purse and pulled out my reading glasses, then carefully retrieved the envelope I had prepared. Inside were copies of my new will, Dr. Chen's psychiatric evaluation, and a letter I had written explaining everything. But I wouldn't need to read from these papers. I had memorized every word I wanted to say. The band was taking a break between sets, and the natural lull in conversation gave me the opening I needed. I moved away from my corner station and walked deliberately toward the center of the reception area, my heels clicking against the marble floor. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "Excuse me, everyone." Conversations died. Heads turned. I could see Lonix's smile falter as she realized something was happening that she hadn't planned. "I'd like to say a few words if I may," I continued, looking around the room at all the faces now focused on me. "I'm Opal Henderson, Tommy's grandmother. I know some of you have been wondering why I'm standing over there by the trash bin instead of sitting with my family." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Tommy, bless his heart, looked mortified. His new wife appeared confused. But Clark and Lonix were frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. "I wanted to take this opportunity to clear up some misunderstandings," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You see, there have been some concerns about my mental health lately. Some people have been worried that I might be suffering from dementia." I reached into my purse and pulled out Dr. Chen's evaluation, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm happy to report that according to Dr. Sandra Chen, a board-certified psychiatrist, my cognitive function is not only normal, but above average for my age. I have no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other mental impairment." The room was dead silent now. I could see Lonix's face turning pale, but I wasn't finished. "I mention this because apparently someone has been telling people I'm mentally declining. Someone has been calling my doctor, my former employer, my friends and neighbors, spreading the word that poor old Opal is losing her mind. This person has been very busy creating a narrative that explains why my family treats me the way they do." I turned to look directly at Lonix, whose mouth had fallen open. I'm sure this person thought they were being very clever. After all, if everyone believes the grandmother is senile, then excluding her from family events isn't cruelty. It's responsible caregiving. Margaret Sinclair was staring at her daughter with obvious shock. Other guests were beginning to murmur, putting pieces together, understanding what I was revealing. "But here's the thing about trying to destroy someone's reputation," I continued, my voice calm, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You better make sure you know who you're dealing with first." I pulled out the second document, a summary of my financial portfolio that Harold had prepared. You see, while someone was telling everyone I was a confused old woman living on a modest pension, I was actually managing an investment portfolio worth $2–3 million. The gasp that went through the room was audible. I saw Clark grab the edge of the table, his face going white. Lonix looked like she might faint. "For 35 years, I've been what you might call a secret millionaire. While I worked multiple jobs and lived modestly, The life insurance money from my husband's death was growing and compounding. I chose to live simply because I wanted my son to learn the value of hard work, not the comfort of inherited wealth. I paused, letting this information sink in. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. I supported my son through college and medical school. I helped with house payments, car loans, wedding expenses. Over the years, I've given them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they never once asked how a secretary could afford to be so generous. They just took the money and assumed it was all I had. Tommy was staring at his parents with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and disgust. His new wife was looking back and forth between me and them, clearly trying to understand what she'd married into. But the cruelest part, I continued, wasn't the lies about my mental state. It was what I discovered they were planning to do with those lies. I pulled out the private investigator's report. Did you know that someone has been consulting with estate attorneys about managing inheritance from an elderly family member with cognitive decline? Did you know someone has been researching expensive care facilities for dementia patients? Lonix actually swayed on her feet at this revelation. Clark reached out to steady her, but his own hands were shaking. That's right, I said, my voice growing colder. While pretending to care about my well-being, someone was actually planning to have me declared incompetent and locked away in a care facility so they could control my assets. They weren't just trying to steal my money, they were trying to steal my freedom. The murmuring in the crowd was getting louder. I could hear fragments of outraged conversations, people expressing their disgust at what they were learning. So here's what I've decided to do about it, I said, raising my voice again to quiet the room. This morning, I signed a new will. Every penny of my $2-3 million estate is going to charity. The scholarship fund at the community college, the food bank, the women's shelter, organizations that actually help people instead of trying to destroy them. The sound Lonix made wasn't quite a scream, but it was close. She grabbed Clark's arm, her perfectly applied makeup now streaked with tears and sweat. Clark himself looked like he might be sick. Furthermore, I continued, I've had my lawyer send copies of my psychiatric evaluation to everyone who was told about my supposed mental decline. They'll learn that not only am I completely competent, but that someone was deliberately spreading false information about my health. I walked closer to Clark and Lonix, my voice dropping but still carrying clearly. You wanted to treat me like garbage? You wanted to put me in a corner next to a trash bin? Well, congratulations. You've just thrown away $2-3 million. Lonix's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating, fanning herself frantically with a napkin. Several guests rushed to help her, but I could see the judgment in their eyes. They understood exactly what kind of person she was. Clark found his voice finally. Mom, you can't be serious. You're upset. I understand. But what, Clark? I cut him off. But families should forgive anything? But I should be grateful for scraps of attention from my own son? But I should pretend it's normal to be seated next to garbage at my grandson's wedding? I turned back to address the room one final time. I want everyone here to understand something. I don't regret the money I spent on my son's education or supporting his family. What I regret is that it apparently taught him nothing about loyalty, respect, or love. The silence was deafening. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing frozen with their trays as they watched this family drama unfold. Tommy, I said, turning to my grandson, I'm sorry your wedding day has become about this, but I wanted you to understand why your grandmother won't be part of your future children's lives. It's not because I don't love you. It's because some people have made it clear that love is a one-way street in this family. I walked back to my corner station, picked up the teddy bear I had brought for the couple, and set it on the head table. This was going to be my gift to you both, I said to Tommy and his bride. Now it's my goodbye. As I made my way toward the exit, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Lonix was sobbing hysterically. Clark was trying to calm her while fielding angry questions from other family members, and Tommy was demanding answers from his parents about what they had done. I didn't look back. I had said everything I needed to say. The woman who had walked into this wedding as the family embarrassment was walking out as the person who had just destroyed their entire financial future with a few well-chosen words. And I had never felt more powerful in my life. 6 months after Tommy's wedding, I was sitting in my new apartment overlooking the river, sipping my morning coffee and reading the newspaper, when my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Clark's name. It was the 15th time he had called in the past 2 weeks. I let it go to voicemail, just like all the others. The first month after the wedding had been the hardest, not because I regretted what I had done, but because the silence was so complete. No calls, no visits, no contact at all from Clark or Lennox. I had expected anger, arguments, attempts to change my mind. Instead, there was nothing. Later, I learned why. According to my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who still maintained contact with some of Clark's colleagues, the fallout from my announcement had been swift and brutal. Word spread quickly through their social circle about what had happened. People who had been told I was suffering from dementia suddenly understood they had been lied to. The humiliation was public and complete. Lennox, it seemed, had suffered what her doctor called a complete nervous breakdown. She had been hospitalized for a week and was now seeing a psychiatrist regularly. The woman who had spent years calling me mentally unstable was now genuinely struggling with her own mental health. Clark had tried to salvage their financial situation, but the damage was extensive. When word got out about their treatment of me, several of his wealthier patients had quietly transferred to other practices. Their country club membership was quietly revoked. Invitations to social events dried up. Most devastating of all, their creditors had started calling in loans. It turned out they had borrowed heavily against their expected inheritance, using my supposed wealth as collateral. When the banks learned there would be no inheritance, they demanded immediate payment. The house was in foreclosure. The expensive cars had been repossessed. Lennox's designer wardrobe was being sold off piece by piece on consignment websites. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt no guilt either. They had made their choices, and choices have consequences. The calls from Clark started in month 2. Tentative at first. "Mom, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." Then, more desperate. "Mom, please call me back. We can work this out." And finally, angry. "You're destroying your own family over pride. Dad would be ashamed of you." That last message had stung, but only briefly. Robert would not have been ashamed of me for refusing to be abused. He would have been ashamed of Clark for allowing it. The turning point came when Tommy called. Unlike his father, Tommy didn't beg or make demands. He simply said, "Grandma Opal, I'm sorry. I had no idea what they were doing to you. I wish I had stood up for you sooner." His honesty meant everything to me. I agreed to meet him for lunch, but only him. No parents, no Lennox, no attempts at family mediation. We met at a small cafe downtown, and for the first time in years, I saw my grandson clearly, not as Clark's son or Lennox's stepson, but as his own person. He looked tired, older than his 25 years. "Grandma, I've been doing a lot of thinking since the wedding," he said over soup and sandwiches. "I always knew Mom didn't like you much, but I thought it was just personality conflicts. I never imagined she was actively trying to hurt you. What made you realize the truth?" I asked. He stirred his soup thoughtfully. "After your announcement, I started asking questions. I wanted to know how long this had been going on, what else I might have missed. The more I dug, the more horrified I became." He told me about confronting his parents, about the fights that had erupted when he demanded explanations, about discovering that many of the stories he'd been told about me were fabrications designed to keep him at a distance. "She told me you criticized my choice of career," he said, "that you thought I was making a mistake going into teaching instead of medicine like Dad. But you never said that, did you?" I shook my head. I had always been proud of Tommy's decision to become a teacher, proud that he wanted to help children rather than just make money. "She told me you disapproved of Sarah because she wasn't from the right kind of family." Another lie? "I adore Sarah," I said honestly. "I was thrilled when you chose someone who clearly loves you for who you are, not what you can provide." Tommy's face was pained. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I should have questioned things sooner. I should have maintained my own relationship with you instead of letting them filter everything." "You were trying to keep peace in your family," I said. "That's not something to apologize for." "But now there is no family to keep peace in," he replied sadly. "Dad and Mom are barely speaking to each other. She blames him for not standing up to you sooner. He blames her for creating this situation in the first place. Their marriage is falling apart. I felt a pang of sadness for this, not because I regretted my actions, but because I had never wanted their marriage to end. I had only wanted to be treated with basic respect. "What about you and Sarah?" I asked. "How are you handling all this?" For the first time since we sat down, Tommy smiled. "We're okay. Better than okay, actually. Sarah never liked the way Mom treated you. She tried to tell me several times that something wasn't right, but I didn't listen. Now that the truth is out, we feel like we can be ourselves." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Grandma, I know you probably can't forgive what happened, but I want you to know that Sarah and I would love to have you in our lives, not as part of some big family reconciliation, just as our family." The offer meant more to me than he could know, but I had learned to be cautious about family relationships. "What does that look like practically?" I asked. "Sunday dinners at our apartment, phone calls when you want to talk, visits that don't require anyone's permission but ours. A real relationship between grandmother and grandson, without interference from people who don't have our best interests at heart." It sounded wonderful. It also sounded too good to be true. "Tommy, I need you to understand something," I said carefully. "I've changed my will, and I'm not changing it back. There's no inheritance waiting for anyone in this family anymore. Are you okay with that?" He nodded immediately. "Grandma, Sarah and I both work. We live within our means. We never expected or wanted your money. We just want you." And so began the most honest relationship I'd had with any family member in decades. Tommy and Sarah invited me to dinner every other Sunday. We talked on the phone regularly. When Sarah got promoted at her job, I was the first person she called. When Tommy's students performed in their school play, I was in the front row cheering. For the first time in years, I felt like someone's family member rather than their ATM. The apartment I'd moved to was smaller than my old house, but it was perfect for my needs. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking the river, and most importantly, it was mine. No mortgage, no painful memories, no ghosts of old obligations. I had used some of my savings to make the apartment exactly what I wanted. Comfortable furniture that I chose for myself rather than hand-me-downs. Art on the walls that I loved rather than pieces selected to impress others. A kitchen stocked with foods I enjoyed rather than ingredients for meals others expected me to cook. I also did something I had never allowed myself to do before. I spent money on experiences. I took a cooking class and learned to make French pastries. I joined a book club at the library and discovered I loved mystery novels. I bought a comfortable car and took weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to visit. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than for other people's expectations. The charitable donations from my will had already begun making an impact. The community college had established the Robert and Opal Henderson Scholarship Fund, which would help working adults complete their education just as I had done years ago. The food bank had been able to expand their services to reach more families. The women's shelter had opened a new wing for mothers with children. My money was helping people who truly needed it rather than enabling people who simply wanted it. Clark's calls had eventually stopped coming. The last voicemail he left was different from the others. Quieter, more defeated. "Mom, I know you probably won't call me back, but I wanted you to know that Lonix and I are getting divorced. You were right about a lot of things. I hope someday you can forgive me." I didn't call him back, but I didn't delete the message either. Maybe someday there would be room for forgiveness, but that day hadn't come yet. Today, as I finished my coffee and prepared for my morning walk along the river, I reflected on how much my life had changed. 6 months ago, I had been a woman begging for scraps of love from people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient resource. Now I was a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than genuine respect. The woman who had stood next to that garbage bin, humiliated and dismissed, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, and finally, truly free. I grabbed my walking shoes and headed for the door. Tommy and Sarah were coming for dinner tonight, and I wanted to stop by the market to pick up ingredients for his favorite dessert. Not because I had to, not because anyone expected it, but because I wanted to, and that made all the difference in the world. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.